Hello everybody and welcome back to another video. You're getting some bonus videos this week, and today we are taking a look at the 6 Contenders teams from the Asia Pacific / Australia region that have made it through the Spring Stage Open and have qualified for the Spring Stage Knockouts, which will be kicking off on Saturday. So before we get into that, I figure we should talk a bit about the 6 Contenders teams that have qualified. This will be kind of World Cup video style, so I'm just going to talk about these 6 rosters themselves in one video. I'm not going to do separate videos for all of them. We'll kind of highlight some of the star players, some of the big names on each of the 6 rosters, and just give you kind of my thoughts on them. And then, of course, when we get to the actual kind of predictions for this week, we will talk about the actual kind of matches themselves. But that's not what this video is about. This one, it's just about talking about the 6 teams that have qualified. So, as you can see here, the 6 teams that have qualified. We have Dreamers coming out of Contenders Korea. We have SPG or Sinprisa Gaming coming out of Korean Contenders. We have O2 Blast coming out of Korean Contenders. Rhodes coming out of the Asia Pacific region. It is a Chinese roster. We have PANTHERA coming out of the Korean region, and Pokerface coming out of the Korean region. So most of the teams, of course, coming out of Korea. 5 of these 6 teams are from Korea, but we do have one non-Korean team. So let's jump in, and the order I am talking about them in is based on the bracket, so it's a little odd here. But let's jump in and talk about the first team, which is Pokerface, an interesting roster. You can see it here on your screen. This roster consists of Aiden, Arrow, Finale, Muse, Peppy, Simple, Valentine, and Aztac. So an interesting combination of players, some of them from the Overwatch League. A lot of the players, in fact, from the Overwatch League. And then quite a few players who come from other places as well. But you can see their damage dealers are Arrow, Finale, and Valentine. Their tanks are Muse and Peppy. The supports are Aiden, Simple, and Aztac. This is an interesting team. A lot of these players have some history with the Boston Uprising, whether it be Uprising Academy or Boston Uprising itself, and also some Toronto Defiant names. Muse, you may remember last year from the Toronto Defiant with the Gladiators year before that. Finale was also on that Toronto Defiant roster. You have Valentine, who was at one point in time, past couple years, on the Boston Uprising. Same with Aztac, who spent time with the Toronto Defiant and the Vancouver Titans. So it's an interesting roster. Then you have Arrow and Simple, who spent time with Uprising Academy. And then you kind of have some other players there to round it out. So it's an interesting team, some definitely some big names. It makes sense why they made it through this group. They are they finished, I believe, 2nd in Korean Contenders. They're the 2nd best team coming out of Korea so far. They won their group in the Spring Stage Open, so they get a first round matchup against a lower ranked team. But they're an interesting matchup, right? They're an interesting team. They're a very interesting team, just kind of across the board. Valentine, a player I've been pretty critical of during his time in the Overwatch League, but in Contenders he's been very, very good. I think this is a team that has very clear kind of star potential. Some very good players are on this roster. It makes sense why they have done as well as they have. You just kind of look across the board. They have a pretty big kind of mainline team. Generally speaking, they play a lot of Muse. They play, if memory serves me correctly, quite a bit of Finale and Valentine. And then their supports, I think it's mostly Simple and Aiden, if I remember correctly. I don't remember seeing a lot of Aztac playing for this team. It was mostly Simple and Aiden or Aiden for this team. They're pretty good. Like I said, they're pretty well-rounded. They have a lot of kind of talent. They did very well in the Spring Stage Opens. You know, they were a top-ranked team. They won a lot, beat a lot of teams, and did very, very well. So I think this is one of those teams that should be among the Contenders teams, one of the favorites to move on. I don't think they're overall a favorite to get out of the region. But certainly among Contenders teams, they are one of the best that there is. And I certainly think they are one of the teams that I'm most intrigued to see how they do with some of their Overwatch League veterans and some of the potential rookies that could be joining the Overwatch League here in upcoming seasons. Up next, we have to take a look at Dreamers, another interesting team named after Dreamer, the player formerly in the Overwatch League, spent time on the LA Valiant and the Houston Outlaws. So you can see this roster here. They have players Easyhan and Spectra as their damage duo, Dreamer and Ligue as their tanks, and Donghun and Meeson as their support. So pretty kind of condensed roster, just the 6 players, mostly Korean, of course, Ligue being the exception here, a Chinese player on this team. Like I said, they're named after Dreamer, so they do want to kind of seemingly play around Dreamer as much as possible. He is kind of the person at the heart of this roster when they kind of play a lot of their matchups. They didn't finish super high in Korean Contenders during the season, but they were very, very good in the Spring Stage Opens, got second place in their region. They're a very good roster, lots of talent on this team. Easyhan, of course, was on the LA Valiant last year. Ligue spent time on the Hangzhou Spark, though didn't get a ton of playtime. Spectra, a name who a lot of people expected to make it into the Overwatch League this year. He's kind of one of those big name flex DPS players coming out of Korea. Spent a lot of time on O2 Blast, but ultimately did not join the league this year, so he finds himself here on Dreamers. He'll get to play in the Spring Stage Knockouts, though, so at the very least, he's gotten very close to making it if he didn't get there, completely, he's able to kind of compete for something. I think they're an interesting team. I think their round 1 matchup against Poker Face will be very interesting because we didn't see them play in the Spring Stage Opens. They were on opposite sides of the bracket, opposite sides of the kind of tournament. They were in separate brackets, so I think Dreamers is an interesting team. I don't think they have the same kind of depth that you see out of Poker Face, for example, but I think they have really good talent. Easyhan looked really, really good in Spring Stage Opens, and if you're wondering, they do play quite a bit of Dreamer and Ligue. They switch between them depending on the map. I actually think Ligue may have played more than Dreamer did, but it's just a very, very solid core, very solid roster. I think Donghun and Meeson, the 2 names that most people would be not super familiar with, both look very good. I thought their kind of support duo, Meeson in particular, was a player who I thought was very impressive, someone who looked pretty good on the flex support, which I think a lot of people love to see. So I do think it's a good team, right? Like, to me, they're probably top 4 of these Contenders teams. It's tough, but I think they certainly have been one of the ones who had a very good run. I think Ligue helps a lot to kind of help round out what this team can be. They're pretty recently put together as well. They were kind of put together just before Contenders happened, and they had a very good run to get where they are. So, yeah, they're an interesting team. I think they'll only get better from here, and I think they're one of the teams I'm most interested in seeing play, just because, like I said, you have some really big names from the Overwatch scene, some legends of the game who've done very well, and so it'll be cool to see how they are able to put it all together when we get to see them against some of these, potentially some matchups against some Overwatch League teams. Up next, we have Rhodes, the only team that is entirely made up of Chinese players. You can see their roster here. They have Odium as the tank player on this roster. They have Pineapple and Aprita as their damage duo, and Kaneki and Coldest as their supports. Also sometimes goes by the name Cold J, does Coldest, but same guy who was on the LA Valiant last year, spent time with the Hangzhou Spark in the past. He's been a somewhat common staple in the Overwatch League scene and kind of the overall Chinese scene. Aprita, Pineapple, Kaneki, other players who've been in the league. Pineapple was on the Hangzhou Spark. Aprita didn't get a ton of time. I don't think he played at all in the Overwatch League last year between the Chengdu Hunters and the Guangzhou Charge, but he was signed And he's a pretty solid player as well. Interesting about Kaneki, of course, is he was a DPS player, a flex DPS player, who made the move over to flex support for this team. Pineapple, of course, the hit scan player as well on this team. And then you have Odium, the only non-Overwatch League player on this team. He's had some other names in the past, most notably 800, a former name of his. So the best team coming out of China in terms of contenders. You can make an argument that if there was going to be a Chengdu Hunters roster, this would be the new look for that Hunters roster. But this is the kind of second best Chinese team in the world. If you consider the Hangzhou Spark as number one, they're number two, right? Not in the Overwatch League. Certainly talent that could be in the Overwatch League. They're very, very good in that regard. But they definitely do not reach the same heights that you'd get out of a team like the Hangzhou Spark. A somewhat disappointing end to their run in the Spring Stage Open. They were the number one team coming out of the APAC region. And though they did qualify, they didn't manage to get those kind of big wins towards the end. Falling flat, I believe it was against Poker Face that they had their first loss, and Dreamers was, I believe, their second loss, if I remember correctly. So it's a team that, it may have been Panthera. I actually think they lost to Panthera, now I think about it. So they're an interesting team. I don't think they're going to be an incredible kind of world-beating roster. I think when you look at a lot of these players, you look at someone like Aprita, Kaneki, Pineapple, they never really made their mark in the Overwatch League, even Coldest. He got some playtime, but he was never someone who kind of really kind of made a mark in the league. So it's a lot of kind of discarded, as bad as that sounds, Chinese Overwatch League players who just never really got their kind of name out there. They never really hit their stride. They never really kind of looked to be one of those kind of top-level, incredibly high-performing teams. So it's unfortunate to kind of have that be the situation here. But in a world where there's not a ton of Chinese teams playing right now, this is certainly your second best Chinese team right now. And they're good. Like, they're a solid team. They are the best non-Korean team from the Spring Stage Opens. There was another Korean team, NT, who did not qualify for the Spring Stage knockouts because you had a team like Rhodes who was able to get in their place. So they are certainly one of the best teams. I think even among the 6 teams that made it, they might be the weakest of them. It's close, I think, between them and some of the other teams. One we'll talk about here in a little bit. But I think it's going to be interesting to see what this team is able to do, right? They're the only other Chinese roster here. You have a majority Chinese roster with the Guangzhou Charge, but this is the only other full Chinese roster outside of the Hangzhou Spark. And I'll be curious to see what they're able to do. But I thought they were a decent-looking team, but I definitely think they don't have the same highs as teams like Poker Face and Dreamers do. So I think they're going to be kind of falling behind those specific teams. And on that side of the bracket, it's very tough. They're going to open up with a game against the Seoul Dynasty, who, despite the fact the Seoul Dynasty have struggled, I would still say that Dynasty would be favored in that match. So it's tough, but I certainly think that they are a team that is capable of getting some of those upsets. It just really depends on what they're able to do with the roster that they have currently around them. But let's move over now to the kind of big name in the Korean contender scene. Of course, the team that everyone looks at as the top team in Korea right now in contenders, and that is O2 Blast. They have a roster of Probe, Knife, and Top Dragon as their damage trio. They have tanks Marvel and Attack, and then supports Opener and Irony. Now, a lot of Overwatch League veterans on this team. Obviously, Marvel spent time with the Seoul Dynasty, spent a little bit of time with the Boston Uprising, spent some time with the LA Valiant last year, so he's a very big name, very well known. You also have Opener and Irony, a support duo. Opener last year was a member of the Washington Justice. Irony spent some time on the Hangzhou Spark last season. So this is a team with some names that the Overwatch League fans may be familiar with, plus some really, really high level kind of play coming out from their damage lineup. Probe, Knife, and Top Dragon. They do have another player. I don't know if he's eligible to play by the name of Proud. I don't know if he is too young or if he is just he joined later. I don't know if he's going to be a part of the roster. I don't fully know. He is 16, so he definitely can't play. but he is on the roster. Just can't participate in this. But of the players that you can have, you have Knife, you have Top Dragon, and you have Probe. Top Dragon, a very hyped player, formerly actually on SPG, a team we have not talked about yet. One of those players that a lot of people thought would make his way over to the Overwatch League was not picked up. Of course, O2 Blast sees that as the opportunity to bring in a superstar damage dealer. He's a huge flex support, flex damage player. Very, very good. But from what I saw, it was mostly, honestly, Probe and Knife getting the majority of the playtime. Probe is that hit scan player for this team. Very hard to sub him out when you need that hit scan play. He's been with this team since for about a year now. Another one of those players, potentially, keep your eye out on him being potentially a player to be added to that San Francisco Shock roster. Knife, the other flex damage player, has just gotten the majority of the playtime from what I've seen over Top Dragon. They both do get playtime. It's not like one doesn't and one does. They do both get playtime, but generally speaking, they kind of switch between them. And then you have the tanks. You have Marvel and Attack. Attack, an off-tank player. Been around the scene for a while. Spent some time with Talon Esports and Element Mystic back in the day. He kind of came into Element Mystic after the Paris Eternal kind of brought in players like Sparkle and Hanbin and brought Rush over as their coach. He's kind of that second generation of Element Mystic, or third or fourth, whatever generation you really want to say. The post-Sparkle generation for that team. So there's a lot of good players on this team. This is definitely the top team in Korean Contenders. Of all the Contenders teams that are going to be competing in the spring stage knockouts, they are absolutely the team that most people, myself included, would rate as the highest. They have a lot of great infrastructure. Of course, they have the connection to the San Francisco Shock. They've been very good historically. You just look down the list of players that have joined the Overwatch League from this roster. Recently, you have Viper, you have Junbin, Babel, Prophet, Bliss. Of course, not the OG Prophet, the new Prophet. Hisang and Max. Last year's New York roster, you had Ho1, you had Merit, you have Proper, you have a bunch of really big names that have come from this roster and joined the Overwatch League. So this is a team with a lot of history. This is a team with a lot of potential and a lot of talent. This is a team that should be expected. If any Contenders team is going to get out of this region, it would be this one. They just have the most kind of hype and the biggest kind of height and the biggest potential to be that kind of superstar roster from the Contenders region, and they have a lot of really good players to back it up. It'll be tough for them to do it 100%. I wouldn't expect them to do it, but if any team were to do it, it will be this one. A lot of names that people will be familiar with, and also some big name rookies who will probably be in the Overwatch League. Some of them potentially by the end of the season, many of them definitely by the start of next season. Next, we have PANTHERA, a very good looking roster here. An interesting team that did have a couple of unfortunate losses going into this Spring Stage Open. Bellasaria and Iris were on this team, but they left to join the Overwatch League. Of course, Iris joining the Shanghai Dragons, Bellasaria joining the Seoul Dynasty. So did have to make a couple of replacements on this roster, but if you can look at their roster here, you can see it still looks pretty good. They have Alien, Neist, and Becky as their damage trio. They have Fate as their tank, and they have a support trio of Slay, Youngjun, and Off. So a lot of Overwatch League names here. Neist, of course, spent time with the Toronto Defiant back in, I believe it was 2021. Did not have the greatest performance there, though he has looked much, much better recently in Contenders. He has been a very, very high-level player. Someone who I think certainly has earned the chance at another shot in the Overwatch League. Becky spent last year with the LA Valiant. Relatively underperforming roster, but I do think Becky was one of the bright spots on that team and is one of the bright spots on this PANTHERA roster. Looks very good on this team. Is a huge part of this team's success so far. And, of course, you have Fate, Overwatch League legend, played for the LA Valiant in 2018 and 2019, gets traded to the Florida Mayhem, goes to the Shanghai Dragons, is an integral piece in that team's grand finals win in 2021. One of the greatest players of all time, and he is making his way into this Spring Stage Knockouts as a member of this PANTHERA roster. Now, I think where this roster is going to fall flat a bit more than some of these other rosters is in some of their kind of performance when you look at kind of this team across the board. They don't hit the same highs as a team like O2 Blast or even a team like Poker Face. I think they're in a very similar camp to Dreamers in that they have the potential to be a strong team, but I think they are going to struggle to get past the likes of some of these other really good teams in this region, right? They're in the same region as O2 Blast. That's who they play their first game. That's really, really tough. Presumably, if they lose, they would play the loser of the match between the Soul Infernal and O2 Blast, or the loser of the match between the Dallas Fuel and potentially Shanghai or SPG. They certainly could win against some of those kind of lower level opponents. I think they could be competitive against some of your bottom two teams in this region from the Overwatch League teams, or some of your bottom two teams from Contenders, and they're probably better than the likes of SPG and Rhodes. And I think they're competitive with a team like Shanghai. It would be a very interesting matchup to see Fate go up against the Shanghai Dragons again. But I think that this team kind of falls a little bit more by the wayside when you consider some of the other teams in this region. There's just a lot of very talented teams coming out of here. And as good as PANTHERA is, as much as they have someone who is a huge leadership figure like Fate, who can be a big part of this team, how well will they do? Now, I mentioned this a bit when I was talking about how this team lost some players, and so Fate is a new addition to this roster, and a team like Dreamers came together very recently. This team should get better with time. They've had a bit of time now. They made it this far. Now they kind of have their core roster. So it will be interesting to see kind of how this team is able to carry themselves going forward with a little bit more time to work Fate into this roster. But I think having a shot caller that is a veteran and has been around the scene for as long as Fate has is ultimately a really good thing for this team. And I think that he will be a huge piece of this team's success if they do find success. I think they're one of those dark horse teams in this region to potentially do something. But I think being in that same group as O2 Blast will be very hard for PANTHERA to ultimately be one of the top level teams. But I certainly have my eyes on them. I think they're a fun team to watch, and they're a really fun team in terms of the talent on this team. So I'm super excited to see what they are able to do in the coming weeks. The final team to talk about here is SPG, or Sin Prisa Gaming. A somewhat interesting roster. I think they're probably the weakest of the Korean teams coming out of the region. But if you take a look at their team, you can see they have a roster of Aid, and Argon as their damage players, Milgaru and 2U as tanks, and Hyunjae and Wuchan as supports. Although 2U, names that might be familiar to some of you in the Overwatch League scene, although spent time back in 2020 with the London Spitfire, and then spent time last year as a member of the Toronto Defiant. He was on O2 Blast for a while as well. And then 2U was on the Seoul Dynasty for part of the 2020 season and for the 2021 season. He's looked a lot better in Contenders recently. He definitely has kind of cleaned up his game a bit. But they also have a bit of a kind of well-rounded roster. They have another tank player in Milgaru who can cover some of the things that 2U is not necessarily as good at. 2U played a lot of the control maps for this team. Milgaru would come in and play Ball or Winston, usually. That's kind of where his strengths are. And then damage play, it was mostly Aid and Although. Aid is going to give you more of that hit scan play, while Although is more of your flex damage player. They have another player in Argon. Argon did not get a lot of playtime from what I remember watching of this team. And then the supports, it's just the two, Hyunjae and Wuchan. And they're fine. I don't have enough kind of time watching this team in Contenders or in the Spring Stage Open to feel like I have a good read on these talent. But this team was pretty good. But like I said, I think they were the weakest of their Korean teams. They had a decently tough outing, to be completely honest with you. It wasn't the easiest for them. But they didn't, they did finish in that kind of bottom two of these kind of 6 teams alongside Rhodes. But they did have to go up against teams, they had a very close series against DAF Esports, which was kind of a surprising result. Then they had to play O2 Blast, and they had to play Dreamers. So they definitely earned their spot here. They had to win some games. They beat some APAC Contenders teams, and they beat the Australian team that was in there. But I think this is probably on the weaker side when it comes to these Korean Contenders teams, or the Contenders teams in general. I would be surprised if they were able to find a win against one of the Overwatch League teams. They certainly could be, kind of have a nice surprising result in one of their games. They play Shanghai the first game. I wouldn't expect them to win that game, but if they go up against a team like PANTHERA, they could potentially surprise them there, or depending on who they play, they could. But I would be surprised to see any of these teams, but especially these bottom two, Rhodes and SPG, get a big kind of result against any of these teams. That's a quick little rundown of all of the teams in the spring stage knockouts that are coming from the Contenders region. Like I said, very quick, very brief rundown. I have not watched enough of these teams in the Contenders circuit to know kind of the strengths about them, but I did spend time watching the spring stage opens to kind of get at least some kind of read on these teams. So those are kind of my general thoughts on these rosters. I'd love to hear from you in the comments down below what you think of these teams. I think it is certainly a challenge for any of these teams to really make that big push and make it into the final kind of mid-season madness, but it would be really interesting if it did happen. And I'm just excited we get to see some more matchups and more teams we haven't seen yet in that Eastern region. And like I say in every video, if you enjoyed this video and want more like it in the future, consider liking and subscribing. Let me know in the comments down below anything that you think I got wrong about some of these teams, or which team you think is the most kind of biggest dark horse, whatever it may be. Let me know in the comments down below. And as always, hope you're all staying safe and staying healthy. And until next time, bye-bye.